Welcome. In today's episode, we're going to continue Unit 4 on the Age of Reason, Absolutism, and Enlightenment by taking a look at 6 or 7 of the key Enlightenment philosophes. Well, first, this period of the late 16 into the 1700s is often called the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, an era when humans and intellectual forward thinkers wanted to apply human reason to all areas of life. This tended to come at the expense of tradition, custom, religious ideas, and wanted to try to make all avenues of human endeavor make sense to human reason. And in particular, applying that to the sciences, government, the economy, criminal justice, and other things. The most central idea to the Age of Enlightenment is this idea of the social contract, the idea that all of society enters into a contract, a binding agreement with each other. And though many different philosophers wrote differently, a core premise of this idea is summed up by John Locke, whom we'll get to in a moment, which is that all human beings have natural rights, God-given rights, fundamental rights. They're simply born with, they're inherent to their nature as a human being. But if what we do is we agree to surrender some of those rights, my unlimited right to do whatever I want, and in exchange, you surrender some of your rights, and we form a government, which then protects those rights. That the fundamental function of a government is to protect our rights, meaning to have a defense force and a police force to protect people's rights from foreigners via a military, and to protect people's rights from other citizens through a police force. And that essentially that's the function of government, is to protect its citizens' rights from each other or from foreigners. The definition of a philosophe, it is simply the French word for a philosopher, and in this age, it refers to a political philosopher, one who theorizes and philosophizes not just how government is, but how government should be and why it should be that way. In this period, particularly in Paris, but also in other great capital cities of Europe, intellectuals and upper and middle class people began to gather for these events called salons, where they would gather in people's large homes, virtually mansions, and they would have these debates, and they would invite top thinkers to these, and they would have these debating points. Meanwhile, a lot of the ordinary rich people who maybe weren't the best speakers and thinkers but wanted to be in on the action would sort of sit on the sidelines of these debates and have small pastries and tea and coffee and just enjoy the show. And these were one of the heights of the social life during the Enlightenment, particularly in France and Paris. Now, to get to several of these philosophers, one of the first is Thomas Hobbes, who lived through the English Civil War, and his most famous work is called The Leviathan. This is an image of Hobbes's Leviathan. Here's Hobbes here. His book was called The Leviathan, and it's an image of royal power, that in one hand the king has a sword and a scepter in the other, but if you look closely, he is made up of all the people of his realm, kind of symbolizing that the king might have all this mighty lordly power and authority and even military might, power of life and death, but he is responsible to the will of the people and has all of the people in mind when he makes those decisions for his realm. He, weighing in on the issue of what people are like when they're born, he believed that people were born with a lot of negativity, that people are kind of born brutish and nasty and need education and church and state and law to rein them in. Otherwise, people would treat each other savagely. By contrast, a man who lived in the later period, who lived through the glorious or bloodless revolution, is John Locke. And Locke, in his book regarding the social contract, wrote about the natural rights of man, such as life, liberty, and property, and that without due process of law, no one, not even the government, can justly take those from us. On the subject of human development, contrasting with Hobbes, who believed people were kind of born with all these negative tendencies, sort of an original sin or a tendency to sin and be evil, Locke believed people were born tabula rasa, or Latin for blank slate, meaning born really a blank slate, like a blank whiteboard. Anything could be written on it. I could write, everyone gets extra credit. I could write, test tomorrow worth half your grade. And so it could be really good or really bad for you. It would just depend. It's a blank slate. It could be anything. And that how we live and how we are raised determines whether human beings grow up to be good or evil, and that it is very subject to how we are raised. In his book in 1690, The Social Contract, Locke writes, "Government relies on the consent of the governed, the consent or approval of the governed." That's us. The government runs us. And so if the government ever loses that consent, people have the right or even the duty to overthrow it. Now, what do we have in our country? Very much follows this, with the idea that we have an election, and that election is how the people give consent to those who govern us from us, the governed. And it doesn't mean that at any minute the people disapprove of the government. We have a system of elections where every so often we give our consent to different leaders to lead the country in a given direction. And so a government that denies that, we would say people have the right, maybe even the duty, to get rid of and overthrow that form of government. Next, the Baron de Montesquieu. I have a picture of Montesquieu here, and here's how the United States interprets the three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial branches. See, Montesquieu was a Frenchman who admired the English form of mixed government, where they had a king who had real power, they had a parliament who had real power, and they had a primarily independent judicial court system that had its own sort of power. He thought that the British model in the mid-1700s was superior to his own French model of the absolute monarchy of Louis XV, who had followed in the footsteps of Louis XIV, the Sun King, the most absolute of absolute monarchs. And he argued that each branch should have its own power with separation of powers. And the U.S. system is extraordinarily based on, well, the British system that inspired it, but the way that Montesquieu defined a good system of government with checks and balances and separation of powers among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a Swiss philosopher who mostly lived and wrote in France, and he also wrote about the social contract a generation or two after John Locke. And he seemed to advocate for a sort of direct democracy by saying that, the government should simply do what is the will of the people. Now, what the will of the people is really hard to say, as we know, right? Do you believe one poll or one vote? If you have a vote of 50% plus one, do you simply honor that? Okay? And so Rousseau advocated for a sort of a direct democracy that, as we know, is hard to determine. Do you listen to one poll? Do you listen to one election? If you have a simple majority of 50% plus one, does that carry all of the power? Do the loudest people make the laws? Do the angriest people make the laws? But he lived in a world where democracy really didn't exist, and he sort of pictured it like the people all agree, and the king would just kind of figure out how this is. So he's kind of a pie-in-the-sky theoretical guy, and here's Rousseau. Another thing he's famous for is the contrary to what Hobbes had said. Jean-Jacques Rousseau believes that people are born in a sort of state of nature, and he called this the noble savage, which is a pejorative term that at the time they routinely applied to Native Americans. But he intended to elevate the dignity and status of these people by saying that this is actually better, that he says that society and education and church and state and laws actually make people worse, right? Remember that in his day and age, to be a noble or a nobleman was the highest thing you could be. And to be a savage, in other words, to be an uncivilized, uneducated, non-European was like the worst thing you could be. And yet Rousseau links those two things together and says that, it is the so-called savages who are more noble than we, right? Which is very contrary opinion for his day and for any day, really, to be saying that, that someone else is better than you. And it's basically the exact opposite of what Hobbes said. Hobbes said people are born sort of brutish and sinful and evil and need to be civilized. Jean-Jacques Rousseau says, in fact, it is civilization that makes people. He would point to small children who seem to have instincts for sharing and nonviolence, but then, man grows up to be more selfish and whatever. And yet both of them agree on one thing. Hobbes and Rousseau agree that humans are born a certain way and need education and society to make them the opposite, whereas, remember, Locke says that we're tabula rasa, blank slate, that we start very neutral and go one way or the other. This is one of the biggest debates in psychology today. It's called nature versus nurture. About 100 years ago, people tended to believe that characteristics like race and other things were very fixed, and that basically human nature was very fixed. But in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, psychology underwent a revolution, and it really went into social development and the idea that no, people are mainly influenced by how we were raised. But in the 90s and early 2000s, there was another pendulum shift as genetics were more understood, and we now really understand that both how one is raised and your circumstances, but also one's genetics, both play a major role in how human beings develop. And so all of these philosophers were really into and latching onto something that is essentially true about human nature. The last three in quick succession, we have Jean-François-Marie Arouet, but he took a pen name called Voltaire. And Voltaire, featured here, was one of the big advocates for freedom of speech. He famously said, "I may disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." What a bold statement. I may find what you say hateful. I may find what you say untrue. I may find what you say to be wrong, but I will defend to the death your right to say things that I really don't like. Okay, that is a very bold statement, but it's also consider in an era when freedom of speech is very limited, and especially anything being written in print is especially censored. He very famously said, "The Holy Roman Empire is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire." That's just kind of a fun quip, but you don't need to know that. Cesare Beccaria. Beccaria is the father of modern criminal justice. He's an Italian philosopher who wrote a book called On Crimes and Punishments, and he supported many things, or he opposed many things that were common in his day that are considered advances in the realm of criminal punishment. Opposed torture. Basically, people will admit to anything under torture. Opposed the death penalty because it was often unequally applied and it gives you no ability to undo it. Said that they were not useful or necessary. Argued for punishment as a deterrent, not simply for vengeance, that you should punish criminals mainly to deter crime, not to simply get back at them for committing a crime. Argued that punishment should be proportional. Sometimes punishments were extremely severe, even for minor crimes. And he argued that trials should be in public and speedy. And these are all things that we see in the Bill of Rights in our Constitution. And finally, Adam Smith. He is considered the father of classical economics, the father of capitalism. He wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations in 1776. He argued that if governments and kings would just leave the economy alone, the economy would work out for the advantage of the most people as if an invisible hand was guiding it. And this mainly works in the form of supply and demand and an equilibrium price point. And this attitude of hands-off approach comes from the French laissez-faire, or leave it alone, to let it be, that the government should largely let it be. Remember, he is opposing what is the most common approach to economics in his day, which is mercantilism, where the government very much puts its thumb on the scale and tries to influence and control the economy of its country in order to guarantee the growth of wealth. Smith argues that's actually counterproductive, that in fact the economy will work the best the more that the government has a hands-off approach. And this is he is one of the top 2 or 3 most significant influential economists of all time. We will talk more about him in a future unit, and thanks for watching.